Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, peace be upon you. Welcome to today's episode of Arba'een Reflections. Today's episode is on the Hawza, the Islamic seminary, which is the central institution of knowledge and knowledge production in our madhab, which has existed for over a millennium. In fact, it is an institution of knowledge which we have today, which we inherit through different forms, all the way originating from the time of the Imams and the classical Imamate period. It is the reason why we have scholars, the reason why we have books and literature and scholarship which we use today to guide our actions. It's a source of our law and the principles of our law and all of the sciences of Islamic knowledge which emanate from this hub of the knowledge of Ahl al-Bayt. And all of it comes from this one institution called the Hawza. To have this discussion today, we are joined by the respected guest, Sayyid Hossein Qazwini. It's a great honor to have him on and to discuss this topic. Sayyid Hussein, in addition to lecturing around the world, is currently based in the Hawza of Karbala, the Islamic seminary of Karbala, in which he is lecturing and teaching on matters of Islamic law and jurisprudence. And it's through his discussion, which we're about to have, that we can understand the history of the Hawza, where it comes from, how we got here with the literature that we have, but also crucially, what challenges do we face today, right now, in using the Hawza to encourage people towards Islam and encouraging students to join the seminary, and what do they attain from this ancient institution of knowledge. So to have this discussion, let us now go to Sayyid Hossein Qazwini to understand what is the origin, the current status and the future of the Hawza. Okay, Sayyidina, so the first question is with regards to the history of the Hawza, where we got this institution from. And the only way that we can claim to be following the words of Quran and Ali Muhammad is if we somehow link the Hawza back to that traditional classical period of the Imams. So looking backwards, where does the story of the Hawza begin? Where is the first place we see it being established?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. If we are talking about Hawza as a place of learning, this had to have started from the time of the Imams themselves. We know that perhaps we can trace this to Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, and more so during the time of Imam Sadiq, where they had discussions, they had circles, they were surrounded by students, and they would discuss, and they would give lectures, and these lectures were recorded. For example, we have a recording of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam in Kufa, because he came from Medina to Kufa, and and he would sit and lecture in Masjid al-Kufa. And we have one recollection that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam had over 900 students that attended these lessons, and all of them would say, Haddathani Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq. Ja'far ibn Muhammad spoke to me and he told me so and so. So we see this very clearly during the time of Imam al-Sadiq and Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam in disseminating knowledge and them raising jurists, fuqaha. This started from the time of Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam. We know this because al-Kishi, or al-Kashi as Ayatollah Khoi would pronounce it, in his Rijal, he divides the companions of the Imams in 3 categories, but he says all of them were fuqaha. 8 of them were from, or 6 or 7 of them were from the companions of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq. 6 of them were from the companions of Imam al-Kadhim, and 6 or 7 of them, these numbers, it's because of him. He says they're either 6 or they're 7, and he adds and subtracts some of these numbers. And there are 6 or 7 of them from the companions of Imam al-Rada alayhi salam. And these were later known as Ashab al-Ijma'. Al-Kashi, he says, تسمية الفقهاء من أصحاب الإمام الباقر, الإمام الصادق, الإمام الكاظم, الإمام الرضا عليه السلام. So these were fuqaha, these were jurists trained by the Imams to issue fatwas. Aban ibn Taghlib, a companion of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq, who died in the life of Imam Sadiq would tell him, اجلس في المسجد وافتي الناس إني أحب أن أرى في الشيعة مثلك. Sit and give fatwas to people. I would like to see among my Shia people like you who issue fatwas, who have reached the stage of being able to issue a fatwa. Zurara, Muhammad ibn Muslim. These are from the companions of Imam Sadiq. You have from the companions of Imam al-Kadhim, Jamil ibn Darraj. You have from the companions of Imam Rida alayhi salam, Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr, Safwan ibn Yahya, al-Bazanti, and so on and so forth. These were fuqaha. The imams would be asked, who should we refer to if we cannot reach you? We live in distant areas. Who should we reach? Sometimes you would tell them, alayka bil asadi, or Zakaria ibn Adam, al-ma'mun ala ad-dini wa dunya. Why don't you ask Zakaria ibn Adam? Or in another narration, Yunus ibn Abd al-Rahman. Yunus ibn Abd al-Rahman, thiqa, is Yunus ibn Abd al-Rahman a reliable source? Akhudu anhu ma'alim ad-dini. Can I take what I need from religion from Yunus ibn Abd al-Rahman? Qala na'am. He said yes. So the imams trained their students to be fuqaha. And the companions of Imam Sadiq were of two types. There were a type that would only memorize a hadith. They would record a hadith and then transmit them to other companions. These were not fuqaha. In fact, they were only narrators who would narrate to other fuqaha. They would narrate these hadith to others who would understand them and comprehend them more than the companions of the Imam. The Imam says, رُبَّ حَامِلُ فِقْهٍ وَلَيْسَ بِفَقِيهٍ. There are some that carry fiqh, but he's not a faqih, he's not a jurist. وَرُبَّ حَامِلُ فِقْهٍ إِلَى مَنْ هُوَ أَفْقَهُ مِنْهُ. And perhaps there is one who carries knowledge or carries fiqh to someone who is more knowledgeable than him. This was the case with some of the companions of the Imams. The other type were the jurists, and they were limited. They were limited in number. They were either 18, 19. They were trained to issue fatwas. In a hadith by Imam al-Sadiq, and we have another similar hadith by Imam al-Rida, علينا إلقاء الأصول وعليكم التفريع. We will give you the general guidelines and principles, and you will derive. The Imams taught their companions the general guidelines to fiqh. They give them the qawa'id, the principles, and it was up to the companions to derive the detailed laws from these principles. So we can say that the first Hawza was actually the Hawza of Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, and then it was continued by Imam al-Sadiq. And then because of political turmoil, because of severe conditions of taqiyya, the other Imams coming after Imam al-Sadiq, they didn't have the opportunity that Imam al-Sadiq did. Imam al-Sadiq lived at a time where the Umayyad dynasty was falling and the Bani al-Abbas, the Abbas dynasty was on the rise. It was a time of political turmoil and a bit of relaxation for Imam Sadiq to be able to spread his school of thought. Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam, on the other hand, he lived in severe cases of taqiyya. He was under watch by Harun al-Rashid. Thus, he wasn't able to raise the amount of students that Imam Sadiq did. Yet, nevertheless, he did have companions that were jurists. One of them is his own brother, Ali ibn Musa, the brother of, Ali ibn Ja'far, the brother of Musa ibn Ja'far. And today, we have a book called Masail Ali ibn Ja'far. Ali ibn Ja'far has a collection of ahadith that he asked Imam Sadiq, and they were purely fiqhi. They're all on jurisprudence, and it has reached us today. Is this book reliable or not reliable? That's another story. But Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam, and this is one of the injustices done to Imam al-Kadhim, that Imam al-Kadhim was a great jurist, and he was able to raise a generation of jurists. And so on. When it came to Imam Rida alayhi salam, Imam Rida continued the line. Imam al-Jawad, Imam al-Hadi, Imam al-Hossein Askari, they continued this Hawza. Of course, it varied from city to city. Imam Sadiq was in Medina. Imam al-Kadhim was in Baghdad. At a time, he was in Medina, but then in Baghdad. Imam Rida was in Khurasan. Imam al-Hadi and Imam al-Hassan Askari were in Samarra. They had companions that they were raising in Samarra. So this was the seeds. These were the seeds to the original Hawza, so to speak. But the main Hawza, if we were to say, it started in Medina, and then it started to have offshoots. At the same time, there was intellectual activity happening in Qom at the hands of the Ash'ari clan. This is at the time of Al-Imam al-Rida, Al-Imam al-Jawad, Al-Imam al-Hadi, Al-Imam al-Hasan al-Askari. There was a tribe that migrated from Kufa to Qom. They were Arab, they were Arabic speakers that migrated to Qom. Qom was a city-state. It was not a city like we have today that, you know, belongs to a greater country. No, Qom in itself was a city-state. And the Ash'ari clan, they were the head of the state. And they were the head of both the state and religion. Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Isa al-Ash'ari al-Qummi enjoyed both political power and religious power. So he was a faqih, he was a jurist, he was a companion of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam and Imam al-Jawad, and perhaps Imam al-Hadi, but more of Imam al-Rida and Imam al-Jawad, and the others from the Ash'ari clan. They were the head of the city. That is why Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Isa al-Ash'ari al-Qummi, he enjoyed political power. He could kick individuals out of the city whom he deemed as deviant, like Sahl ibn Ziyad, or like al-Barqi, the author of al-Mahasin. He kicked them out of the city. While at the same time he was Shi'i, he was religious, and he was a jurist. So the Hawza of Qom actually originated from the time of the Imams, from the time of the Ahlul Bayt. They were on a very strong relationship with Imam Rida and Imam al-Jawad. And we see a lot of activities, intellectual activities happening in Qom. They cared for the narrations, for the ahadith. They wrote these narrations. They wrote books on the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt. And they were very careful as to not narrate from any unreliable source. The sanad has to be authentic. There should be no irsal in the sanad, meaning that there has to be a connected chain of narrators. The Qummis took this very, very seriously. And anyone who had shortcomings in relating narrations, they were immediately kicked out of the city of Qom, or they were excommunicated in today's Catholic terms, so to speak. So this was at the time of the Ahlul Bayt.
Clearly, there's a distinction which is very helpful between a jurist and a person who's simply narrating a hadith from one person to another. And it seems like the moment when it comes to our fifth Imam, we start to see the emergence of jurists. Before we continue, is it fair to say this didn't happen before because of the political pressure on the Aimma? Like, is that the reason why we don't see the emergence of faqihs before this time?
Yes. During the life of the first four Imams, they did not have the opportunity to disseminate fiqh. Imam Ali alayhi salam fought 3 civil wars, or these 3 civil wars were enforced upon him. Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam faced the turmoil of Muawiyah and the backstabbing of his army generals and some of his cousins. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, of course, he was Imam for 10 years before the revolt in Karbala, before his uprising in Karbala. Yet still, it was severe taqiyya conditions. Muawiyah was slaughtering the companions of the Imams, or he was buying some of them. He was buying them off. Imam Zain Abidin, again, he did not have the opportunity. Yes, he did have the opportunity to buy slaves, educate them, and spread them throughout the Islamic world. But it wasn't more on fiqh. It was Imam Zain Abidin alayhi salam concentrated more on spirituality, more on dua. Thus we see his munajat, we see Sahib al-Sajadiyya, we see dua Abu Hamza al-Thimali. It was at the time of Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam where they had the opportunity to establish the school of thought in fiqhi terms. Up till the time of Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, the school of thought of Ahlul Bayt, in fiqh-wise, it wasn't very clear what was their fiqh. Yes, maybe in terms of salah, fasting, the school of thought of Ahlul Bayt was known for its fiqh, but not in the details of mu'amalat and ibadat and hajj. All these came about during the time of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. That's why we believe that Imam Sadiq is the founder of the school of thought. And the founder meaning that he showed the fiqh of the Imams. Otherwise, the school of thought was founded maybe during the time of Rasulullah or on the day of Saqifa. From the beginning, we see a clear school of thought of rejecting the khulafa. But fiqh-wise, it was during the times of Imam al-Baqir, but more so in the time of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam.
Right. So this helps because, as you mentioned, for aqaid and for aqidah and these things, you're right. We have a clear definition of what this madhab is from earlier. Interestingly, each imam is a source of knowledge, for any multitude of issues. But when it comes to the fifth and sixth imam, they're now equipping their companions to then travel and become other sources of knowledge in new cities. You mentioned Qum, for example. There was no imam in Qum at that time, and yet they had been empowered to give rulings. Was this the method of the imams, that you come to Medina, we train you, we give you the technical study that you must have, and then we actively send you to certain locations to continue? Is that how it spread from the beginning?
Absolutely. In fact, this is the Islamic theory of learning. In Ayat al-Nafr, فلولا وما كان بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وما كان المؤمنون لينفروا كافة فلولا نفر من كل فرقة طائفة منهم. They cannot all come out and seek knowledge. We know that people have other things to do. There's businessmen, there's doctors, there's physicians. Only some can seek knowledge and come and relate this knowledge to others. So the Quran says, فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ, from every group, let a number of them come, nafara, let them migrate or let them leave their homes, لِيَتَفَقَّهُ فِي الدِّينِ, so that they may develop understanding of تَفَقُّهْ فِي الدِّينِ is to develop an understanding of religion. وَلِيُنذِرُوا قَوْمَهُمْ إِذَا رَجَعُوا عَلَيْهِمْ, and then let them warn their people when they go back to them. So this is the Quranic principle, that you come from different parts of the world. Groups of people come to Medina because that was where the Prophet was and where the Imams were. Come to Medina, study, and then go back. And this is also a very important point, where وَلِيُنذِرُوا قَوْمَهُمْ إِذَا رَجَعُوا عَلَيْهِمْ. The purpose of studying is not to stay in the place of learning, but to go back to your cities, to your hometowns, and spread the knowledge that you learn. So the verse says, وَلِيُنذِرُوا قَوْمَهُمْ إِذَا رَجَعُوا عَلَيْهِمْ. The point is to come to the center of learning, be it Medina, be it Najaf, be it Qom, be it Karbala, where it is after reaching the stage of tafaqquh, وَلِيَتَفَقَّهُ فِي الدِّينِ وَلِيُنذِرُوا قَوْمَهُم. After they have reached the stage of tafaqquh, which today we call ijtihad. And by the way, I found something very interesting in the books of ijtihad and taqleed. Recently, I've been looking into this topic because I plan on teaching a course on ijtihad and taqleed, inshallah. So what I noticed is that Ayatollah Sayyid Sistani, in his lectures on ijtihad and taqleed, he prefers to use the word tafaqquh. He says ijtihad had a negative connotation in the early days, especially by the Imams. They warned us of ijtihad because ijtihad was synonymous with qiyas and istihsan and things used by the other school of thought because of lack of narrations, authentic narrations. They were forced to using things like qiyas, analogy, and so on and so forth, where this is called ijtihad. And we have narrations that condemn ijtihad. Of course, we know that today ijtihad has a different meaning. Ijtihad is not synonymous with qiyas, but it is more of deriving an Islamic law from its original source. Sayyid Sistani says, well, I prefer using another word that's mentioned in the Quran and in the narrations, and that is tafaqquh, faqih, fuqaha, faqaha. This is mentioned in the Quran, لِيَتَفَقَّهُ فِي الدِّينِ. The companions of the Imams were called fuqaha, tasmiyatul fuqaha. They were not called mujtahids. The narrations that emphasize on seeking knowledge, they emphasize on tafaqquh and not ijtihad. So that I found that very interesting, that Sayyid Sistani prefers to use the word tafaqquh or faqaha instead of or al-faqih instead of mujtahid.
This is helped because also that this is more of a Quranic concept.
It's a Quranic concept,
and the others are always. It's harder to prove to somebody this is a part of the deen when we cannot use as many verses to derive it from.
Right. Ijtihad was never used. It hasn't been used in the Quran to mean deriving an Islamic law. We have istinbat. We have the word istinbat, which is synonymous to ijtihad. It's mentioned in the Quran, but not ijtihad. And as I said, in the formative period, ijtihad had a negative connotation. Even in the books of the Shaykh al-Tusi, al-Sayyid al-Murtala, it had a negative connotation. They would say, we followers of Ahl Bayt, we do not use, for example, we don't use qiyas, we don't use istihsan, we don't use ijtihad. Ijtihad was always included in the sentence. It was up until the time of al-Muhaqqiq al-Hilli, the author of Shara'i', where he said, wait, hold on a second. Qiyas is a form of ijtihad. It's one of the tools of ijtihad. Qiyas is not ijtihad. Ijtihad is not qiyas. Qiyas is a tool, part of ijtihad. There are some that use it, and there are some that reject it. We, the followers of Al-Bayt, will reject qiyas. But this doesn't mean that we should reject ijtihad. Ijtihad is exerting an effort in deriving an Islamic law from its original sources. So, did the Ahlul Bayt have this culture of bringing companions, teaching them and spreading them? Yes, absolutely. There are, in fact, a great deal of companions of the Imams that were from Kufa. They were from Kufa. In fact, there were some families like Al-A'yan and others that came from Kufa to Medina. And they studied under the Ahlul Bayt. They studied under Imam Sadiq and Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Kadhim, and they recorded their hadith, and then they went back to Kufa, and there they spread the hadith of Ahlul Bayt. And by the way, Kufa was also a major center of learning at the time. So you have Medina in Hijaz, you have Qom in Persia and Iran, you have Khurasan as well, and then you have Kufa. Kufa was a major center of learning, not just for the followers of Ahlul Bayt, but also for others. Baghdad and Kufa, both of these cities were known to be centers of learning. Of course, not just for the followers of Ahlul Bayt. It was more for the other schools of thought. Abu Hanifa was from Baghdad, and Baghdad was known as Madrasat al-Ra'i. It was a school for not so much picking up hadith, but more so on relying on qiyas and istihsan. Where Medina was known for Madrasat al-Hadith. You have people like Malik ibn Anas and others that relied, Ahmad ibn Hanbal more so later on, that relied only on hadith. So we have to look at the overall picture. The Imams, alayhimus salam, they were also part of this ummah. While there was intellectual activities happening in the Shi'i community, there was intellectual activities happening in the Sunni community, and they were not completely isolated. There were a lot of discussions taking place at the same time. We know that Abu Hanifa studied under Imam al-Sadiq. Malik ibn Anas studied under Imam al-Sadiq. So these two houses or several houses, they were also intertwined. They didn't live in segregation. Even in Baghdad, even during the time of Sayyid al-Murtala and Shaykh al-Tusi, this is in the beginning of Al-Ghaybat al-Kubra, the two houses were not separate. It was one major Islamic Hawza that had Sunni and Shi'i scholars living in one city and teaching at the same time. Baghdad had scholars like Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar, and it had a scholar like Shaykh al-Mufid. And they were in discussion with one another. They were in conversation with one another. You see this very clearly in the discussions of Shaykh al-Tusi, Sayyid al-Murtala, Shaykh al-Mufid, Sayyid al-Murtala, Shaykh al-Tusi. These three scholars who were theologians and jurists, you see them very clearly they're in conversation with their Sunni counterparts and their Sunni colleagues. You won't find a book by Shaykh al-Tusi, for example, which doesn't mention Sunni opinions. You will find that in his book Al-Khilaf, very clearly. You'll even find it in Al-Mabsut, which is a complete compendium on Shi'i fiqh. yet he includes Sunni opinions. Let alone books on kalam. You see this in Sayyid al-Murtala's al-Shafi. You see this in the books of al-Mufid. They were in conversation with others. But after the split, when Sheikh al-Tusi, of course, he was forced to flee from Baghdad after his house was set on fire, his library was set on fire, there was sectarian violence in Baghdad. He was forced to flee to Najaf. Here we see a segregation of the Sunni Hawza from the Shia Hawza. And it has its advantages and it has its disadvantages. The advantages is that there's no more taqiyya. They could speak freely and talk about our school of thought freely with no taqiyya, with no fear. But at the same time, after the disconnection, the two schools of thought could not benefit from one another. For example, in usul al-fiqh, Shi'i usul al-fiqh is affected by Sunni usul al-fiqh, and so is Sunni usul al-fiqh. It is affected by Shi'i usul al-fiqh. This was at a time when they coexisted in one city. But after that, after the segregation, both schools of thought did not have that benefit any longer. So Sheikh al-Tusi was forced to flee from Baghdad. Baghdad, a major hawza of learning for both Sunni theology and Shi'i theology. He was forced to come to Najaf and establish the first fully Shi'i hawza, where there was no more Sunni scholars preaching or teaching their own school of thought. It was a fully Shi'i hawza in the city of Najaf.
So once we get to Najaf, now we start to see what we recognize as today's Hawza in the way that it's been established. But up until then, I think what we found is the Hawza was a very dynamic term and it was used for different circumstances. When the Imam is speaking in Medina, that's technically Hawza when he's teaching his faqihs. When those companions are leaving to different cities and they have a correspondence with the Imam, that's also part of what was considered Hawza. And like you've mentioned in Baghdad, when we have these hubs of knowledge production, that's also one of the capabilities of the Hawza. But then, we get to this point where whilst there are faqihs, there are no longer faqihs who have access to the Imam because the time of ghaiba has begun. And that's when we see Sheikh Tusi going to Najaf, forced to go to Najaf. How do we see Hawza change from the Imamate period where we still have some correspondence to the Imams, and now in ghaiba, especially after into ghaibat al-kubra, where now we lose that connection and there's more responsibility conferred to the faqih? How does Hawza change through this period?
There's a major change. Intellectually, there's a major change. The fuqaha that lived at the time of the Imams, they were very careful that the fatwa that they issue not only resembles the opinion of the Imam, but even in wording, they prefer to use the same exact words of the Imam. So they didn't even want to change the wording. And hence, their books of fatwa was actually books of narrations that became books of fatwa, except they took out the isnad. So you see Sheikh al-Saduq, and he's one of the prime scholars in this time period. He writes al-Muqni' and al-Hidayah, which are two books of fatwas. They're actually narrations, but without the isnad, but it's a book of fatwa. So they were very careful. They were so cautious that their fatwa does not, leave the words of the Imams. This obviously, and this is called al-usul al-mutalaqat. In fact, Sayyid al-Burujudi says that if we needed narrations and we couldn't find a narration in the four books, Al-Kafi, Min La Yahdhur al-Faqih, At-Tahdhib al-Istibsar, we can go to these books like Al-Muqni' wal-Hidayah by Sheikh al-Saduq, or by Sheikh al-Tusi's Al-Nihayah. Sheikh al-Saduq's Al-Hidayah, I apologize, I said Al-Nihayah. Sheikh al-Saduq's Al-Hidayah Al-Muqni' and Sheikh al-Tusi's Al-Nihayah. These are books of fatwa, yet they stick to the narrations of the Imams without asanid.
But those books come secondary, say, to interrupt you. Like, we first go to the four books of fiqh, and then if we need an issue, we then go to them. Yeah.
This is according to Sayyid al-Burujurdi. Not everyone accept this. According
Okay.
to Sayyid al-Burujurdi, we can refer to these books as books of hadith, although they are books of fatwa, but we can consider them books of hadith. Why? Because these scholars were very careful that their fatwa mirrors the words of the imams and it doesn't leave the words of the imams.
Sheikh
Of
Saduk's
course,
book, Madinatul Ilm, which is only recently being, are you with me, Sayyid?
yes, I am with you. I apologize.
Alhamdulillah. The book Madinatul Ilm, which was recently kind of restored, and they're trying to consider whether, was it a fifth book, is it a book of narrations? Was this one of the 4 legal texts, or was it one of the secondary books of hadith, which you would then use?
It was actually, some scholars believe that if Madinatul Ilm existed today, if we had, are you with me, Brother Abbas? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Sayyid, yeah.
If we had Madinatul Ilm today, it would have been a 5th source of hadith. But unfortunately, it was lost. So if it was today, it wouldn't be a secondary source. It would have been a primary source. Probably even it would go before Man La Yahduru al-Faqih.
Wow.
So coming to the jurists after this period, we see that no, they were a bit more relaxed. Their fatwa didn't have to be straight from the words of Ahlul Bayt. And the first jurists to open the door of ijtihad and not stick to the words of Ahlul Bayt were 2 scholars who are called Al-Aqdamain, the 2 early scholars, Ibn Junayd and Ibn Abi Aqil, who wrote compendiums on the fiqh of Ahlul Bayt. Unfortunately, their books have not reached us. Al-Ahmadi, Al-Fiqh Al-Muhammadi, and I forgot Ibn Abi Aqil's book, but these were very important books at the time. I remember reading their Ibn Abi Aqil's biography in Najashi. He says that whoever would come to Hajj, he would have a book by Ibn Abi Aqil, the Shia, of course. I would presume that he was the top marja at his time, because his risala, every Shia would have to carry his risala. They opened the door for issuing a fatwa not based on the wording of the Ahlul Bayt. Of course, it was inspired by the words of Ahlul Bayt, but in issuing the fatwa, they didn't have to, strictly say what the imams said. They began to derive. So we see the process of ijtihad from the time of Ibn Junayd, Ibn Abi Aqil, and then Sheikh al-Mufid, Sheikh al-Tusi in his book Al-Mabsut. We see him deriving, not strictly narrating. He wasn't just narrating the words of the imams and issuing a fatwa based on a narration, or wording his fatwa in the words of a narration, but he's actually deriving. And then up till Al-Muhaqqiq Al-Hilli, probably it ended with Al-Muhaqqiq Al-Hilli, the age of issuing a fatwa in the words of the imams. Like, for example, Al-Mukhtasar Al-Nafi' by Al-Muhaqqiq Al-Hilli, or even his Ash-Shara'i'. His Ash-Shara'i', you see, Al-Muhaqqiq Al-Hilli, he begins with a law and then he begins with its furu'. Sayyid al-Burujurdi and his student Ayatollah Muntabari, they say, see, the first law that he begins with, that is the usul. That is the exact wording of the imams. But then he begins mentioning the furu'. That is from him. That is his own derivation from the usul.
So when we study Sharia Islam in the Hawza, where the opinions we're discussing in Muhaqqiq Al-Hilli's book is actually his own discussions, and we cannot associate those to the initial usul.
You see, in a Shara'i', he will begin with a general law, and then he begins to give its details, and then he goes into the roots. Those roots are from him. Those are his derivations. Unlike the general law that he starts, that is from the Imam. Sayyid al-Burujudi calls that al-usul al-mutalaqat. These are general laws that were passed on from generation to generation to the scholars up until the time of Muhaqqiq Al-Hilli. As for the roots, he doesn't claim that these were taken from the Imams. He says these are my own derivations from the general principles that were given from the Imam. So there's a difference. And then we see in the works of Al-Alam Al-Hilli, this was ijtihad at its best at the time of Al-Alam al-Hilli. Through his works, he had introductory works like Tabsarat al-Muta'allimin. He had works for Kitab Fuqaha, Tadhkirat al-Fuqaha. He had Mukhtalif al-Shia. And all of these books were compendiums, 5, 6, 7 volumes and more. Mukhtalif al-Shia, where he talks about the various views amongst the Shi'i school of thought. Tadhkirat al-Fuqaha is the various views, the opposing views amongst all of the fuqaha, not just the school of thought of Ahl al-Bayt. And he has An-Nihaya and so on and so forth. Al-Alam al-Hilli did a major justice to fiqh, where the amount that he wrote on every single topic, comparative fiqh, comparative usul, comparative within the school of thought, comparative within amongst the Islamic fuqaha. We see fiqh developing at the hands of Al-Alam al-Hilli, and then after Al-Alam al-Hilli, at the hands of his son, Fakhr al-Din, and then at the hands of Fakhr al-Din's student, Al-Shahid al-Awwal. Al-Shahid al-Awwal, fiqh reached its climax up till then through his faqaha, through his application of ijtihad. And of course, each one of these scholars, he had his own additions. He had his own additions, whether it was a practical addition or it was theoretical through usul al-fiqh. And then Al-Shahid al-Thani, after Al-Shahid al-Awwal, Al-Shahid al-Thani's had major contributions in fiqh, in usul. He was brave. He was able to question many of the theories that were held by previous jurists. For example, marriage to a Christian and a Jewish woman, is this allowed? Is this not allowed? Previous jurists said this is not allowed because the Quran says, do not marry a polytheist. وَلَا تُمْسِكُوا بِعْصَمِ الْكَوَافِرِ. Or in another verse, نعم ولا تنكحوا المشركات حتى يؤمن, and do not marry the polytheist woman. And Jews and Christians were considered polytheists up until the time of Shahid al-Thani. Shahid al-Thani came and said, wait, hold on a second. Christians and Jews are not polytheists. Although what they did could be considered a form of shirk. Claiming that Jesus is the Son of God is a form of shirk, but they are not mushrikeen. There's a difference between performing an act of shirk and being a mushrik yourself. So they're monotheists, and hence we could marry a Christian woman or a Jewish woman, and so on and so forth. He was very brave in his fiqhi views. Now these the Hawza, it didn't remain all in Najaf. Can I get into this, or did you want to talk about something else?
No, because that's exactly where we're going. So because of all these debates and because of the variety of cities in which they're in, you're right. These publications come from all sorts of places.
So we have Najaf, Sheikh al-Tusi, and then his son, Abu Ali al-Tusi, who is also known as al-Mufid al-Thani. He had a smaller circle. His circle of students was not as big as his father's. It was a smaller circle. And then after that, we see a decline in Najaf. So when we say that Najaf is a seminary 1,000 years old, we assume that there was intellectual activity for 1,000 years straight. This is not very accurate. There was a flux. There was a time where there was great intellectual activity in Najaf, and other times there was a decline. We see that after Najaf, the Hawza, the mother Hawza, it moved to Hilla. At the time of Ibn Idris al-Hilli, al-Muhaqqiq al-Hilli, Ibn Tawus, the brothers of Ibn Tawus, al-Sayyid Ahmad and al-Sayyid Ali. You have Ibn Dawood al-Hilli, al-Muhaqqiq al-Hilli, al-Alam al-Hilli, Ibn Dawood al-Hilli, Ibn Idris al-Hilli. We see the school of thought of Hilla, which is a very rich school of thought. It was a very rich Hawza at the time. At the same time, we have intellectual activities happening in Halab, in Syria. We have Ibn Zuhra al-Halabi. We have Abu Salah al-Halabi. We have Bani Zuhra, whom Al-Alam al-Hilli would correspond to, and he has a full ijaza to Bani Zuhra. We have Abu Salah al-Halabi. We have, who else from Halab? Halab had a Hawza of its own. At the same time, we see in Trablus, in Tripoli, in Lebanon, northern Lebanon, there was a Hawza. And I mean, when I say Hawza, it doesn't have to be a big Hawza where there's lots of schools, but there was intellectual activities happening in Lebanon. Jabal Amil in Lebanon, major intellectual activity. You have Shahid al-Awwal, Shahid al-Thani, they were from Lebanon, from Jabal Amil. You have Al-Muhaqqiq al-Karaki, who later on moved to Iran, Al-Hur al-Amili, who also moved to Iran. We see a surge or a migration from Jabal Amil to Iran at the early Safavid period, where Shah Abbas al-Safawi and others, the founders of the Safavi school of thought, they wanted legitimacy, and at the same time they wanted fuqaha to come and lead their country, their government. Thus they opened the door of migration, and they welcomed fuqaha from Lebanon. Al-Muhaqqiq al-Karaki moved. Al-Hur al-Amili moved. Sheikh al-Bahai is Lebanese. Sheikh Bahauddin al-Amili, he's from Jabal Amil, yet they moved to Isfahan, the capital of the Safavid dynasty, and then we see Isfahan itself became a center of learning. It became a Hawza of itself. You have Al-Majlisi al-Awwal, Al-Majlisi al-Thani, Sheikh Muhammad Taqi al-Majlisi and his son Sheikh Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi in Isfahan, having their own Islamic seminary. I could say that many other cities in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, in Lebanon, they had seminaries, but these are the main ones. If we move further away, we will see that further away in time, of course, not in distance. Karbala had its own seminary. Karbala was known for its Akhbari movement. The Akhbaris centered in Karbala, especially at the time of Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani. They saw that Karbala was a good ground to disseminate their school of thought. Of course, Akhbaris, they took over the scene, not just in Karbala. Al-Majlisi was an Akhbari. Al-Hur al-Amili was an Akhbari. Sheikh Na'matullah al-Jazairi was an Akhbari. They took over the scene. But it reached the climax during the time of Al-Wahid al-Bahbahani. Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani, who was the head of the Hawza here in Karbala. And this caused Al-Wahid al-Bahbahani to migrate from Kermanshah, from Iran, from Bahbahan and Kermanshah, to move to Karbala to intellectually fight and combat the Akhbari school of thought, and that gave rise to Usulism and to the Usuli school of thought here in Karbala.
That is actually one of the most exciting moments, in my opinion, in the intellectual development of our madhab, the Usuli Akhbari, dialogues in Karbala. But that's just one. In many of the cases you've mentioned, the more that knowledge spread across the ummah, the more there's confrontation with new ideologies and new thoughts, and that led to internal debates within the Hawza. And that's something which continues now. Within any Hawza we have now, there are always different opinions and approaches and schools of thought within the school, and we argue and discuss issues with each other. Was there a case where different Hawzas had themes, like they were defined about having certain positions and stances? And did that develop then, or has that been happening more recently?
Yes, that was the case. For example, Bahrain had a Hawza, but the overall theme of the Hawza was that it was Akhbari, was an Akhbari Hawza. And that's where Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani came from. Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani was from Bahrain, and he had an Akhbari upbringing in Bahrain. Until today, there are remnants of the Akhbari school of thought in Bahrain. You have the Asfour family, Al-Asfour, who are Akhbari. They still exist till today in Bahrain, and they have, they're highly respected. But that was the overall nature of their house. It was Akhbari. Karbala, it was overall Akhbari until the time of Al-Wahid al-Bahbahani. Al-Wahid al-Bahbahani changed everything. Of course, credit also goes out to Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani. Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani was akhbari, but at the same time he was moderate. He was not a staunch akhbari. He was not like Mullah Muhammad Amin al-Istirabadi or Sheikh Na'matullah al-Jazairi. Al-Wahid al-Bahbahani, Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani was a moderate akhbari. And in fact, in one part of his book, Al-Hada'iq, he says that I've come to the conclusion that we akhbaris, we need to tone it down a bit. We speak very harshly of certain ulama, like Al-Alam al-Hilli and others, because of their theory on Rajal and, you know, dividing hadith into 4 sections, Sahih, Muwathaq, Hasan, and Da'if. Al-Alam al-Hilli was, you know, he was accused of taking this from the Sunni school of thought and of sunnifying usul al-fiqh and the fiqh of Ahl al-Bayt. And there's a famous saying amongst akhbaris that Islam was destroyed twice, on the day of Saqifa and the day that Alam al-Hilli was born. Twice Islam was obliterated or destroyed. So this is very extreme. Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani said that we have to tone it down, especially when it comes to our ulama. We should not disrespect our ulama. This will affect our deen. You know, my deen, my faith will be questioned when I do this. So Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani really toned it down a bit. And because of Al-Wahid al-Bahbahani's intellectual rigor, he was able to, you know, overcome the Akhbari school of thought and bring back Shi'ism back to Usulism, or, you know, Al-Usuliyya, where we could rely on the Quran. While Akhbari said we cannot rely on the Quran because only those who the Quran has spoken to, meaning the Ahl Bayt, can understand the Quran. Not all of the hadith are authentic. Not everything in the 4 books is authentic, while the Akhbaris believe that everything is in the 4 books and other books is authentic and reliable. We don't have to perform ihtiyat on everything, while Akhbaris believe that, you know, we have to perform ihtiyat, and so on and so forth. So Al-Wahid al-Bahbahani was able to deal with the Akhbari school of thought. And Karbala became an Usuli Hawza afterwards. The scholars of Karbala, like Sharif al-Ulama, who was a student of Al-Wahid al-Bahbahani, was an Usuli. Sayyid Ibrahim al-Qazwini, one of our forefathers, a student of Sharif al-Ulama, the author of Dawabit al-Usul, he was Usuli. Whoever came after in Karbala was Usuli. We go back to Najaf, we see that Najaf had a lot happening at the time, but it was because of scholars that migrated from Karbala to Najaf. We see a great deal of scholars that later on went to Najaf. They were actually from Karbala. They studied under Al-Wahid al-Bahbahani in Karbala. You have scholars like Sheikh Ja'far Kashif al-Ghata, Sayyid Mahdi Bahr al-Ulum, even Sheikh Murtala al-Ansari. These scholars were trained and educated in Karbala, yet they migrated to Najaf. And interestingly, one of the reasons why we see migrations of scholars is because of pandemics or epidemics. There were outbreaks of cholera here in Karbala and in Najaf. So because of these illnesses, you see scholars, they leave the city, they go somewhere else. Here in Karbala, our forefather, Ayatollah Sayyid Ibrahim al-Qazwini, had to go to Samarra. He had to go to Samarra. Sometimes it was because of epidemics. Sometimes it was because of invasions. There was a Wahhabi invasion of Karbala, the famous Wahhabi invasion. The scholars had to flee. They had to go to other places. Those who remained were massacred and they were killed. So we see scholars migrating to Najaf, back again to Najaf. Sheikh Ja'far Kashif al-Ghata, Sayyid Mahdi Bahr al-Ulum, Sheikh Murtala al-Ansari. There we see intellectual activities picking up the pace again in Najaf. Going back to your question on themes, yes, some houses have specific themes. For example, the contemporary Hawza of Mashhad. After the migration of Mirza Mahdi al-Isfahani. Mirza Mahdi al-Isfahani was in Najaf, educated in Najaf under, I believe, Mirza Na'ini and Sheikh al-Isfahani, and that, that generation of jurists and scholars. Mirza Mahdi al-Isfahani moved back to Mashhad, and he raised a generation of scholars. Mirza Mahdi al-Isfahani is known for the Tafkiki school of thought, which is very anti-philosophy. It's a bit mystic. It has its they have the Tafkiki school of thought. It has its own aspects. Tajreed al-Ruh, where the soul could leave the body. Mirza Mahdi al-Isfahani was known for this. His soul can leave the body, and then he can order it to come back, and so on and so forth. But a major feature of the Tafkiki school of thought of Mashhad, which was founded at the hands of Mirza Mahdi al-Isfahani, is the anti-philosophy, anti-Arfan sentiments. This was in Mashhad. Until today, we see remnants of that in some of the scholars today in Najaf. In Mashhad. And in fact, it was the school of thought of Mashhad that pressured the philosophers of Qom, specifically Al-Alama Tabatabai. As we see, we're coming to contemporary times. Al-Alama Tabatabai, Al-Sayyid al-Khomeini, and Al-Sheikh Muntadhari, who were the three prime scholars of philosophy, or the teachers of philosophy, in let's say 70 years ago, 60 years ago. It was the school of thought of Mashhad that pressured Qom to stop teaching philosophy. And indeed, Sayyid al-Khomeini stopped teaching philosophy. And he no longer went back to teaching philosophy. He began teaching Kharij, al-Fiqh and Usul. Al-Alama Tabatabai did go back to teaching philosophy after a while. Sheikh al-Muntadhari did go back to teaching philosophy. But that was a prime aspect of the school of thought of Mashhad, and that is that we have to go back to the school of thought of Ahlul Bayt. We should not accept anything that has come out from other than the Ahlul Bayt. Nothing Greek, nothing Aristotelian. So no philosophy, no Arfan either. We have to come to the traditions of Ahlul Bayt. And to pick and choose from the traditions of Ahlul Bayt, this is blasphemous. All of the traditions of Ahlul Bayt are accurate, they're authentic, and we should base our theology and fiqh on the narrations that we have. We see a strong defense for Bihar al-Anwar in the school of thought of Mashhad. They feel that Al-Alama al-Majlisi has been disrespected by some of the scholars of Qom. Bihar al-Anwar has been disrespected. These are the pearls of the Ahlul Bayt. So you see that theme happening in Mashhad. While, for example, in Najaf, you see the theme of Ilm al-Usul. Ilm al-Usul is a major theme in Najaf. There's a major concentration on Usul. Fiqh as well, Rijal as well, but not so much as Usul, especially from the time of Shaykh al-Ansari, Sahib al-Kifaya, his student, and then the students of Sahib al-Kifaya, al-Na'ini, al-Asfahani, al-Iraqi, and then up till the time of Sayyid al-Khoi. This period was the golden period for Usul al-Fiqh. So you see this very clearly in Najaf. While in the Hawza of Qom, in contemporary times, we see that Qom is a well-rounded Hawza. If you want Usul al-Fiqh, you will find it in Qom. If you want Fiqh, you will find it in Qom. If you want Tafsir, you will find it in Qom. If you want Arfan, philosophy, you will find it in Qom. Also, this is something very, very contemporary. I've noticed that Qom recently has taken has been concentrating on contemporary fiqh. Contemporary fiqh. Fiqh for women. Fiqh of politics. Fiqh of economics. Fiqh of the environment. Fiqh of sociology, and so on and so forth. While in Najaf, it's still very, the traditional fiqh. Salah, Saum, Hajj, Zakat, Makasib. They haven't dwelled into the new topics that have risen in fiqh. So you can see this clearly now, especially with modernity, with the advent of the internet and lectures circulating online. We could clearly see the differences in the contemporary houses.
This is a very helpful summary. We've almost come up until the 21st century, and that summary of the 20th century with Ayatollah Khoui as well, kind of ending that, not ending, but being a key part of that period from Sheikh Al-Ansari is very helpful. And also we kind of understand many of the internal debates which got to us to where we are. So the Asuli, Akhbari debate, the pro-philosophy, anti-philosophy, and we see signs of this in the Hawzas today. But what the environment we have today is very different. We have Najaf, we have Qom, and then we have Mashhad and Karbala and multiple other houses, and in Lebanon as well. But it's, people think that Najaf and Qom are the two kind of centers in size and in heritage, especially since Ayatollah Hariri as well in Qom. And now, like, these are the hubs. Are these the main sources of knowledge production today? And how are these two houses related to one another?
We can't deny that Qom and Najaf are the two main centers. Of course, I would say Qom comes first, just because of what happened in the last several decades. Saddam and the Ba'ath Party, they really tried to ruin the Islamic seminary of Najaf. Whoever stayed, either was executed, or was imprisoned, or had to live a very strict life at home, very careful, don't leave the house, and so on and so forth. So during the 70s, 80s, 90s, the Hawza went back, or didn't go back, but it transferred to Qom. After the fall of Saddam, we see, Najaf picking up again, standing on its feet, and it's doing a fantastic job. And I think that it will reclaim its prominence very, very soon. But today you see that the major center is Qom. How can we define centers? First of all, the amount of maraja, that are there, the mujtahids that are there, the amount of students that are there, the quality of the lessons, the quality of the classes that are offered, the institutions. Qom has transferred into institutions. It's not just classrooms and teachers teaching, but there's institutions in Qom. There's tahqiq happening. They're publishing books. They're publishing research papers. There's specializations happening now in Qom. There's jurists that are specializing in ibadat. Others are specializing in mu'amalat. Within mu'amalat themselves, there's specializations happening. We don't see this that much in Najaf. There's not a lot of specialization. Najaf is still very, very much traditional. And there are scholars and teachers that very much like that. They like the fact that Najaf is traditional. Another difference we see between Qom and Najaf is that Qom is more organized. So there's a structure. If you go to Qom, you have to be listed at a university. There's tests, there's exams, there's reports that you have to give. So everything's structured.
Formally systemized, you could say.
It's a formalized system. Ahsan.
Yeah.
There's a formal system. While in Najaf, there's no formal system. Now, is that necessarily a bad thing? No. It's a difference of opinion. I'm not judging as to which system is better. I'm just mentioning what's out there. In Najaf, there are some scholars that believe نظام الحوزة في عدم النظام. The system of Hawza is no system. That is how we keep the system of Hawza alive. Because if you force students to take certain classes, to attend the classes of certain teachers, you're ruining Hawza. The whole point of Hawza is that each teacher rises because not because people are forcing his students to attend his class, but they're attending his class because of his personal merit, because of his delivery, because of what he's offering, because of his knowledge. So there has to be freedom in Hawza, freedom of choice. You let the students choose what they want, choose the teacher that they want, choose the lessons that they want, no problem. While in Qom, there is a system, there's a formal system, but the system has that drawbacks as well, where there's teachers that you have to choose, or you have no choice but to attend under this teacher, or to take this class, this specific class, or you have to pass this examination. So that's one of the differences between Qom and Najaf. there are attempts to formalize the Hawza of Najaf, and there are attempts to take that formality away from.
Informalize. Yeah, both are happening at once. It's true.
Both are happening at the same time. So you see this in
what about Karbala? What in the Hawza of Karbala, are we seeing it more of the Najafi style, or are we seeing attempts of systemization of the courses?
In Karbala, you will see different schools, and each school belongs to different maraja. So you have various maraja, they have their own schools, and these schools are very formal. So there's registration, there's specific requirements that you have to fulfill in order to be registered at a Hawza. There's exams. You have to pass the exams. Unless a student doesn't want the monthly stipend or the monthly salary and doesn't care for a certificate, then you're free to take any class that you want and at any school that you want. But there's a majority of students that, you know, they've left their homes and they want the monthly salary. So in order to have the monthly salary, you have to be at a formal institution that has exams. You have to abide by the law. So we have both. We have both types of students in Karbala. We have students that are registered at a formal Hawza, and they take their exams at the Hawza. They take the lessons at the Hawza. And you have students that are not registered. You know, they're independent. They're financially independent, and they take lessons, Hawza lessons at various Hawzas and with the teachers that they want. And you have students that are a mix of both. You see them in the morning, they're at the formal Hawza, taking their lessons there. But in the afternoon, they're taking, you know, lessons that are not part of the curriculum, or they're not part of the former curriculum at their Hawza. But Karbala is an upcoming Hawza. We have a good amount of students. We have, just about 1,000 students. We have over 12 or 13 schools. There's dormitories. And today we have about 10 Bahth al-Kharij in Karbala, 10 or 11 Kharij lessons, 10 or 11 qualified Bahth al-Kharij teachers in Karbala. And that's very significant. Unfortunately, there are some that see Karbala like, for example, Basra or some of the southern cities in Iraq. They liken Karbala to others. And this is an injustice to Karbala. Karbala is a well-established Hawza. It has scholars, it has jurists, it has at least 10 to 11 scholars that are capable of teaching Bahth al-Kharij. But we also have problems at the same time. We have students that come from abroad. They are not granted residency, legal residency. Legal residency is only offered in Najaf at the time. So we have to work on that and have that get sorted. We have problems with funding, with the Shahriya, with the monthly salaries. The salaries of Karbala are a lot less than the salaries of Najaf, although the students are taking the same exact courses. For example, they could be taking Kifaya, and students of Najaf are taking Kifaya. But the students of Najaf, their monthly salaries are higher than those of Karbala. So what that creates is that students automatically go towards Najaf and not stay in Karbala. So we do have challenges, but we hope that we are able to overcome these challenges with the help of Allah and the blessings of Imam Hussein, inshallah.
Inshallah. And in that final comment, I was thinking to myself, what are the conventions of a Hawza? Like, what are the requirements for it to exist? And one of them is, of course, the presence of scholars and the classes which happen. And all the ones you mentioned are in the vicinity of the Aimma as well, and of Ahl al-Bayt. And there seems there's barakah which comes from those places. And they're all very established. Karbala is an old Hawza, as you mentioned. But being long established, having qualified ulama, being close to the Aimma, these are none of the things which we'll find in the West, or at least not in the same way at the moment. And yet there are these multiple attempts to, I don't want to use the word modernize, but to make the Hawza in the East useful for those people in the West to come over and study, and to establish homogeneous Western-based Hawzas and seminaries to then train even maybe faqihs in the West. But we are without all of these conventions. Do you think it's possible, and are there attempts where we need to bear certain conditions in mind when we establish houses in the West?
I think it's very much possible to establish Islamic seminaries in the West. In fact, we already know that such seminaries already exist. In fact,
Mine is an example, for example.
absolutely, absolutely. In fact, what I've noticed in the past 2 to 3 years that there's several online houses where you could be anywhere. You don't have to even attend in person, where all of the lessons are online. Everything today is online. Even the books, the PDFs, the lectures are all online. Is this possible? Absolutely. I think it's possible, and it all depends on the student's will and sense of determination. If a student is determined and has the will to reach the stage of ijtihad and asks Allah Azza wa Jal for help, this person can definitely reach the stage of ijtihad. Having the imams close to you, this is definitely a blessing and it's a plus, but this doesn't mean that a hawza cannot exist without the presence of the imams. The presence of the imams is definitely a plus, and it is what drew the hawza. Scholars, they came to these places of worship, places of ziyarah, and then they established the hawza. So it wasn't by chance that Najaf has a seminary next to the shrine of Imam Ali. No, people came to the shrine of Imam Ali and then they started a seminary. And it's the same story with Karbala, Qom, and Mashhad. But does that mean that there cannot be a seminary lest there's the grave or a shrine of the Ahlul Bayt? No. In Bahrain, there was an Islamic seminary. In Qatif, there was an Islamic seminary. In Jabal Amil, in Lebanon, in Isfahan, many of the cities in Qom, in Iran today, they have an Islamic seminary and they're raising jurists. So it's very much possible. As long as these Islamic seminaries in the West, and this is what I emphasize to friends and organizers of the Islamic seminaries, I tell them, make it a real Islamic seminary, in the sense that the lessons that you're teaching don't just teach, let me give you an example. Islamic history or Nahj al-Balagha. Both very important. I do not mean to underestimate Nahj al-Balagha or Islamic history. But if an Islamic seminary in the West only concentrates on these topics, but does not concentrate on fiqh, usul, and rijal, these main sciences, you will not be able to reach, you will not be able to raise jurists and fuqaha. There has to be a concentration on fiqh and usul al-fiqh and rijal. Does this mean that other classes cannot be offered? No. Other classes should be offered, and it should be good. Tafsir, akhlaq, Nahj al-Balagha, aqaid, Islamic history, contemporary Islamic history, maybe history of the country where the hawza is being established or the hawza lessons are being offered, even a bit of sociology, even a bit of economics. At the end of the day, a jurist needs all of these sciences, needs as much as knowledge as possible to derive Islamic laws correctly and accurately. But this should not be at the cost of fiqh, usul al-fiqh, and rijal. If the hawzas in the West want to be taken seriously by the hawzas in the East, and if they want to raise jurists, you see, we have to ask the question: what is the goal of the hawza in the West? A hawza in London, or a hawza in the US, or anywhere in the West? What is the goal? If the goal is to raise speakers and orators for the minbar, then they don't need to trouble themselves with fiqh, usul al-fiqh, and rijal. Yes, they should teach Nahj al-Balagha, Islamic history, concentrate on aqaid, concentrate on tafsir, and so on and so forth. But if they want to raise jurists and fuqaha, in addition to these lessons that I mentioned, tafsir, Nahj al-Balagha, and all that, there has to be a concentrated effort on fiqh, usul al-fiqh, and rijal. And in Arabic as well, not just in English. Not just in English. I know that English is being taught, and now there's textbooks and books being translated from Arabic to English. This is wonderful. This is good. This will help the student understand these, the original text. But they have to master Arabic. A Hawza student in the West, if the goal is to become a jurist, they have to master Arabic. At the end of the day, the Quran is in Arabic. The narrations are in Arabic. The classical texts are in Arabic. And it's very difficult to translate the original text into Arabic. For example, to translate Al-Kifaya, that's a very difficult job. And even if one day it's translated, it should not suffice. A student should not rely on the translation and leave the original. They still have to be able to read the original in Arabic. Because Kifaya in itself, one line of Kifaya sometimes, I taught Kifaya twice. And each time it took 4 years. So, I taught Kifaya for 8 years, and I know how difficult it is. Sometimes one line of Kifaya would take up to an entire lecture of 40 minutes. And the structure of the words, they're structured so, intricately that translating it to English, it might not do justice to the text. So my emphasis is on the Arabic language. If a scholar wants to become a jurist, wants to become a faqih in the West, they have to master the Arabic language. And they have to master these three sciences: fiqh, usul al-fiqh, and rijal. If someone is determined, they have the will, they can become jurists, even if you're sitting in London, even if you're sitting in Los Angeles, even if you're sitting in Washington. It is very much possible. I've seen jurists in Lebanon. There's no shrine of Ahl Bayt in Lebanon. I've seen jurists in Kuwait. They haven't set foot at an Islamic seminary in Najaf or Qom or Karbala or Mashhad, but they became jurists in Kuwait. So it's very much possible, and I'm very much hopeful that these houses will produce jurists, inshallah. They will produce jurists. If they take this advice, inshallah, they will be able to raise jurists in the West.
This is very useful guidance from the perspective of the Hawza, but I'd like for our last question to be for the perspective of the potential student, because it may well be that somebody is watching and learning about the Hawza and thinking, how can I join this rich heritage of Islamic education? And maybe let's assume someone's in the West and interested in Hawza. We don't want them to feel too scared or too fearful of the true depth of knowledge that we have, and that impulse to study is so pure. What would we say to those students or potential students of Hawza to encourage them to embark on this path?
I would tell them that, in fact, I know I have a lot of friends that would like to go to Hawza and have been saving up money, and they want to move, and they want to sell everything and then move either to Qom or Najaf or Karbala. I tell them, listen, you don't have to move. Believe me, you don't have to move. Today, the world has become a global village. You can stay at home. Why come and start from scratch and sell everything and lose your business or lose your job, and you come to Karbala and Najaf and study, and then when you go back home, you don't know what to do. You're carrying knowledge, but you face a burden of financial difficulties. You face financial burdens. Stay in the West. You have a family, you have children, you have a house, you have a job. Stay in the West. You don't need to do anything. Just have a will to study and become a scholar. And you could do so from the West, from the online houses, or from the houses that are already there and that are established. They can do so. They don't need to be intimidated. If they have the will and determination and the intelligence, they can reach the stages that thousands of others before them have reached. But it requires dedication. It requires having a goal and trying to reach that goal. But it's very much possible. Even if you have a job and you're married and you have kids, even if you're doing it part-time, you don't necessarily have to do it full-time. It's not about the quantity, Brother Abbas. There are some people, they think if I study for 10 hours a day, within so many amount of years, I'll become a mujtahid. It's not about the quantity of studying. It's about the quality of studying. It's about what you study, which teacher you're studying with, which book are you reading, how are you understanding this book. This all has an effect on helping the student reach where he wants to reach. So I would tell students not to be intimidated, to enroll in the Hawza that they feel comfortable with, or at the local Hawza in their city, in their country, and perform tawakkul ala Allah, rely on Allah. وَمَنْ يَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ فَهُوَ حَسْبُهُ وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. This is a form of jihad. It's an intellectual jihad of deciding to take this path. It's very much possible, and Allah will be with them, and Allah will support them, inshallah.
Inshallah. These are beautiful lines to end our discussion on. We pray that our listeners take this advice, and if not for them, then they share with others who maybe are interested in Hawza and benefit from this discussion. Sayyidina, thank you so much. Thank you so much all the way from Karbala. Pray for us, pray for all of the listeners, inshallah. Thank you. And let's end.
It was an honor, and thank you so much for hosting me tonight.
No. It was a long time coming, but alhamdulillah, we did it. I'm very grateful, Sayyidina. If you could end, inshallah, on a salat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil faraja. And we mean it. We encourage all of our listeners, especially those who are interested in joining the Hawza or seeking different ways of Islamic knowledge. It could be part-time, it could be reading a book, but reading the right book and being part of the canon of Hawza literature and Islamic literature. We encourage everyone to join, and to join with that intention, that pure intention of gaining knowledge to spread to others and to be part of this struggle. We are praying for everyone in this act of service, and it's really helpful for us now to understand why we have the Hawza in the way that we have it now, in its different geographical diversity, or the internal debates which have shaped the form of the Hawza, or to understand a little bit about the different scholars through whose interplay we have contemporary ulama today. This is a very helpful way of understanding the map of the Hawza and where we are in it right now, and it helps to project where we are trying to go towards in the future. Inshallah, if the Hawza can be used to serve the cause of the Imam and bring about his hasty return, it is a great successful endeavor for us all to be part of. So again, we thank Sayyid Hossein, and we thank all of you for listening. I thank all of you for listening. I hope you enjoyed, inshallah. And we will see you soon in the next episode of Arba'een Reflections.